To tip off this NBA season on FanDuel, you can choose your own rewards, which means you can play your game any way you want.
I get to choose my rewards?
Yep.
Great! Now, excuse me while I lock in.
All customers choose your own reward right now in the FanDuel app. 21 plus and present in select states. 18 plus in Kentucky. Opt-in required. Rewards are non-withdrawable. Restrictions apply, including bonus and token expiration, leg requirement, and max wager amount. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I want to talk today a little bit about the historical processes of anti-colonial struggle, particularly the period after the Second World War. There have been periods of anti-colonial struggle in the global south before the Second World War, but obviously in the decades from the removal of the British from India and the uprising against the French in Vietnam, all the way through to the departure of Britain from Hong Kong in 1997. So it was a 50-year period. Anti-colonial struggles were extremely violent, or they were for the most part, the recipients of extreme violence from colonizers. Obviously, anti-colonial struggle from colonized people is rarely done peacefully, successfully anyway. And also, you have situations whereby these anti-colonial struggles are successful. And perhaps this is the most significant transition of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. If you look at the 20th century through the prism of imperialism and empire, the first half of the 20th century, as we discussed the other day with Hobsbawm, could be characterized as imperialism's civil war. And the second half of the 20th century is a kind of imperialism's decline and fall, or de jure imperialism's decline and fall. As we can see, empire has all sorts of ways of sustaining itself, and these were established through the post-war Bretton Woods institutions, which were captured by the United States through debt and aid and sanctions, and the application of soft and hard power through kind of what has been described in the 1990s and 2000s as liberal interventionism. And what we see time and time again is that whether it's cast as kind of benign or malign, that the global South struggles for autonomy have been mercilessly crushed in most cases, but in a few, particularly Vietnam and Cuba, they have they have managed to sustain themselves. So the reason why I want to talk about this is as a result of the kind of extraordinary and shocking speech made at the Munich Defense Conference this week by United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Now, if you will recall, at the conference last year, it was the turn of J.D. Vance to lecture European powers on how they had allowed mass immigration and liberalism to rot their institutions from inside, and they had managed to somehow abandon their culture, and that as a result, whiteness, Westernness, and Christendom, by implication, were all under threat. And this was this kind of overtly kind of cultural fascist a pronouncement. But the speech by Rubio, which is actually seen by some commentators, in the kind of the centre-right commentators, as being a conciliatory speech of him trying to make nice with Europe, is and it got a standing ovation as well. It tells a lot about the way that European sort of strategic thinkers or non-thinkers, really, as it would appear to be, still respond to the Trump administration. There they are, kind of, clapping like seals when Rubio essentially says, you have forgotten how to be imperialists. You were good at it once, and you kept the world under your boot heel, and it can be like that and should be like that again. And this is an unbelievable thing for an American Secretary of State to say. I mean, they probably think it all the time, but to say it is really quite something. So, recently there have been up until the last couple of days, talks about strategic autonomy from America. You have the French government cracking down on Elon Musk and looking at strategic tech autonomy. There's talk of serious legal repercussions for out of control American tech companies and increased defense spending, energy autonomy, all these kind of things that any sensible European Union would have done a long time ago. And it only takes Rubio to turn up and say some vaguely kind of coded white supremacy things that are sort of kind of favourable towards Europeans for them to get terrifically excited about this. So here is the speech. He says, "We gather here today as members of a historic alliance, an alliance that has saved and changed the world. When this conference that began in 1963, it was in a nation, actually, it was on a continent that was divided against itself. The line between communism and freedom ran through the heart of Germany. The first barbed fences of the Berlin Wall had gone up just 2 years prior. And just months before that conference, before our predecessors first met here in Munich, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear destruction. Even as World War II still burned fresh in the memory of Americans and Europeans alike, we found ourselves staring down the barrel of a new global catastrophe, one with the potential for the new kind of destruction, more apocalyptic and final than anything before in the history of mankind." So on and so forth. He goes on to talk about the Berlin Wall, and how when that came down, we reached this 1990s moment I often go on about the end of history. He says, but the euphoria of this triumph led us to a dangerous delusion that we'd entered, quote, the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy, that the ties formed by trade and commerce alone would now replace nationhood, that the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world. I don't actually think that's what Fukuyama said in totality. I don't think that necessarily he was talking about the end of the nation state. He was talking about alternatives to capitalism and liberal democracy, withering away, and that's essentially history's big questions had now been answered. Um, but it was the kind of the neoliberals of whom the Trumpites are the kind of heirs that were particularly keen on free markets for labor, free markets for finance. They weren't particularly keen on that the universality of liberal freedoms for all human beings. They've never really kind of talked about that particularly, but they're very keen on freedom for capital to do as it wished, and a global marketplace which was still going to be imperially structured. There were still going to be producer countries producing cheap things like grain and cotton, and consumer countries benefiting from all of that. There was still going to be the sorts of hierarchies that I'm sure people like Trump and Rubio absolutely love. Rubio says this is a foolish idea that ignored both human nature and it ignored the lessons of over 5,000 years of recorded human history, and it cost us dearly. In this delusion, we embrace a dogmatic vision of free and unfettered trade, even as some nations protected their economies and subsidized their companies to systematically undercut ours. He means China, shuttering our plants, resulting in large parts of our societies being deindustrialized. It was Wall Street that did that. It was Wall Street that outsourced American jobs. Lots of little bits of revisionism being slipped in here. Shipped millions of working and middle class jobs overseas and handed control of our critical supply chains to both adversaries and rivals. Okay. We increasingly outsourced our sovereignty to international institutions, so a dig at the UN, while many nations invested in massive welfare states at the cost of maintaining the ability to defend themselves. Okay, America obviously didn't do that, and that's why it has crashing life expectancies. Anyway, this is even as other countries have invested in the most rapid military buildup in all of human history, he means China, and have not hesitated to use hard power to pursue their own interests. To appease a climate cult, here we go, we've imposed energy policies on ourselves that are impoverishing our people. So this is a kind of like a mixed bag of all this kind of reactionary sort of stuff. So we need to kind of wade through that a little bit. In pursuit of a world without borders, we opened our doors to unprecedented waves of mass migration. So kind of your standard racism, so on and so forth. So he goes on to talk about the world after the Second World War. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, the world that Europeans built was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind the Iron Curtain, and the rest looked like it was soon to follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swathes of the map for years to come. Against that backdrop, then, as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But together our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make. This is what we did together once before, and this is what President Trump and the United States want to do again now, together with you. So a kind of a Faustian bargain is being offered here. And this is why we do not want our allies to be weak, because that makes us weaker. We want allies who can defend themselves so that no adversary will ever be tempted to test our collective strength. This is why we do not want allies to be shackled to guilt and shame. We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who, together with us, are willing and able to defend it. What he is saying, to go through the kind of the coded language here, is we know we have pissed you off. We know you are angry. We know we have alienated you. We know we have caused epic damage to a relationship that we suddenly realize is actually useful. And we know that if we are not careful, you will make friends with China. And the ultimate anti-colonial power of the 20th century. And this is something that we seek to avoid. And for European leaders, once again, to excitedly lap that one up, it does show the kind of memory failure that many of them have. Um, to look at what he's saying there, he talks about godless communism and the hammer and the sickle led to the decline of a once great Europe. Well, if you look at anti-colonial struggles, let's just look at India and Vietnam. Okay, look, even if we just look at those two in the time we have. So India, I mean, firstly, India doesn't become a communist country under Nehru. It's quite sympathetic towards the communist bloc, but it doesn't become a communist country. Um, and India is able, the able to kind of break free of the British Empire for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the strength of Indian nationalism that has developed during the Second World War. You have Indian soldiers at the end of the Second World War who just simply refused to comply. When the British decide to put on trial at the end of the war, the members of the Indian National Army under Subhas Chandra Bose, who died in mysterious circumstances during the war, there's mass outrage across India. It's seen as, well, there were plenty of Indians who fought for the British and viewed the INA as enemies. At the end of the war, most Indians thought, well, they if a little misguided, they were sort of trying to do the right thing by their country. Leave them alone. And there were in that time period when the British considered sending the Indian Army because they, until 1947, the British had not given up on India. They had not given up on the possibility of holding on to India. When they thought that they might want to send the Indian army to places like Malaya or Greece, even, they realised that it was going to be completely impossible. That men would mutiny, they would just refuse. And if you are a colonial elite of several 100,000, you cannot control hundreds of millions of people in India. The Indian Empire was always ruled to some degree with an element of consent, and once that's gone, that's gone. And once the ability to control huge amounts of military manpower in Asia are gone, power itself is gone in Asia and in Africa too. So the loss of India was a kind of a complex set of historical processes that had begun probably after the First World War and had reached their conclusion after the Second World War. It had precious little to do with communism, and it had precious little to do with this kind of cultural weakness or lack of confidence or whatever else in the imaginations of Trump's inner circle. What it had to do with was the fact that India had reached a kind of a national self-determination kind of tipping point during the Second World War. It had gone through its own kind of militarized industrial revolution during the Second World War. It had a huge mass army, highly trained as a result of the Second World War, and it had a kind of a degree of martial competence from fighting everybody from the Afrika Korps through to the Japanese and the Italians during the war, and it was and the war had broken and bankrupted financially and kind of spiritually almost Great Britain. If we look at the example of Vietnam, um, again, we see something that's obscured by US-led kind of anti-communist. I don't want to say the word hysteria because it gets overused but US anti-communism in the post-war or era. Vietnam was a place where uh, Kennedy particularly looked at Vietnam and said, it is the place where we stop communism. And in part that was to do with a belief in the containment of Maoist China. The loss of China in 1949 is a huge, huge blow to America, and it's an enormous crisis. And the fear was that Chinese that countries across Southeast Asia producing resources like rice and rubber and tin and all these other handy things that American capital needs, and that also had potential markets for the future. One of the things that American capitalism looked to China to provide was people, large markets that would buy goods and sell labor. It was going to be, and ultimately in the 90s and the 2000s, that's kind of what you get. It, everybody's dreams sort of come true, as China opens up and joins the World Trade Organization and becomes a place that manufactures lots and lots of stuff cheaply and buys lots of stuff as well. This version of things is kind of fundamentally derailed now, and only in the kind of the Obama era was China starting to kind of not really respond in the way desired, and this is where kind of a lot of neocon hawkishness comes from, these kind of fantasies of war with China, which I mean I think will end very badly. So the Vietnam, though, from the end of the Second World War onwards, is a classic national liberation struggle, and a successful one. It takes 3 decades, but ultimately, whilst the Vietnamese Communist Party lead that struggle, huge numbers of ordinary Vietnamese people have never read Karl Marx, they've never read Mao, they've never read Lenin or anybody else, see the fight against French colonialism as something naturally in an age of anti-colonial struggles, as the kind of the foundation of their society, and the Indo-Chinese wars have much less to do with communism than is popularly believed. Communism in China, communism in Vietnam are vehicles for national renewal. They are vehicles that address the internal and the external crises that colonized Asian countries are facing. And one of the reasons why the nationalists fail in the Chinese Civil War is because actually many Chinese peasants didn't view them as sufficiently nationalist. They viewed them as kind of US proxies. So the I mean, it's sort of ridiculous nonsense from Rubio, who is essentially trying to take the combined history of European colonialism and to do something or other with it. I think to essentially draw America and the US, the America and Europe together in some kind of combined grouping of, and there's something explicitly racist about this, some combined grouping of white nations that will try to kind of recapture some kind of essence of that colonial past. I mean, the idea that Europe is going to be colonizing anybody at all is for the birds. But America, it must we must point out, has kidnapped the sovereign head of the Colombian government, threatened Greenland, and is engaged in supporting a genocide in Gaza. Um, you know, obviously the Gaza genocide is ongoing, um, and they have recognised. I'm sure all of this is really the product of a sudden perceived vulnerability that maybe um, trying to humiliate and insult Europeans hasn't gone down very well. Um, the the script goes on. An alliance ready to defend our people, to safeguard our interests, and to preserve the freedom of action that allows us to shape our own destiny, not one that exists to operate a global welfare state and atone for the purported sins of past generations. This is again this macho American right rhetoric, which is let's not just American at all. This is kind of um, embraced in Great Britain on the political right. The idea that we should stop apologizing for slavery, we should stop apologizing for colonialism, we should stop um, kind of reading history. If you look at the kind of the history reclaimed group, we should stop reading history in this critical manner and indeed actually kind of rejoice in the empire. It's that sort of language. An alliance that does not allow its power to be outsourced, constrained, or subordinated to systems beyond its control. So an alliance where we undo the last 50 years of Western economic history. One that does not depend on others for the critical necessities of its national life, and one that does not maintain the polite pretense that our way of life is just one among many, and that asks for permission before it acts. So again, here we have in this speech this kind of coded idea that we should now really be looking to abandon all the last remaining shreds of international law, asking for permission before it acts. We should be less timid and more dynamic and more kind of warlike. This speech is a kind of an indicator of, I think, the hole that the Trump regime has dug for itself, and its supposed conciliatory nature is really a kind of a concern that um, the Europeans are now looking elsewhere. And that the fact that Europeans are now looking elsewhere, they are looking to China and looking to um, kind of do to compensate for the unpredictability of America. China, repressive state, but America, repressive state. China, repressive state that seems to be relatively unlikely to do anything particularly erratic. America, repressive state, constantly doing erratic things. The the EU is kind of weighing up its options here, but they do seem to have been wooed back. You know, this shows the kind of the fundamental supine nature of the kind of the EU leadership, the current EU leadership, and they seem to be kind of rather wowed by Rubio's kind of horrendous rhetoric. The speech goes on, and I'll put a link to it below if you really have to read it. But reading it from a kind of a critical perspective is an interesting task, because it shows you beneath the sort of like the kind of the bluster and the nonsense, these sort of rather kind of Rudyard Kipling-esque notions about burdens and civilization and the role and responsibility of defending this sort of notion of civilization, which is normally just a sort of kind of nonsense that right-wing sock puppet accounts on Twitter come out with. Some guy in like Myanmar who has 60,000 followers talking about the Renaissance, and it's sort of kind of like that. But in this instance, it is the Secretary of State, and these are the kinds of things that are, once you've said them, are you can't take them back. This is the kind of speech that many years later, historians will look at as a kind of a key and significant moment where the language of not just the Republican Party, but the language of the unfettered far right. These are the sorts of ideas that are talked about by the Front National and Wielders and people like that. These are ideas that are articulated by fascist and neo-Nazi parties constantly, and they have found a place within what was once kind of conservative with a small c discourse. It can't be thought of as that any longer. These are openly fascistic ideas. But the good news is that the global south is fundamentally a different place. It is not a place that can be pushed around in the fantasy version of things that Rubio is talking about here. Sure, you can kidnap Nicolas Maduro. However, anything beyond that, the attempts to recolonize parts of the world, they'll fail. They will fail. And we will see eventually in places like the Sahel, for example, where governments that are, whatever else one thinks about them, capable of acts of national liberation, are currently kind of becoming ever more kind of assertive and confident. And I guess the recent airstrikes on militants in Nigeria are kind of all sort of related to that, I suspect. But a lot of what is being said here is pretty unpleasant stuff, but it's also fantasy, and you have to see it for that. It's absolute fantasy, and the fact that you have a US Secretary of State openly fantasizing at the Munich Security Conference to European heads of state is telling in terms of the workings of global soft and hard power. Anyway, I'm going to leave you there on those musings on national self-determination and liberation movements, and I'll catch you on our next Explaining History podcast soon. Take good care, everyone. All the best. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.